When his fingers found hers, the touch was small, almost nothing, and yet it carried the weight of everything they'd never dared to say aloud. The summer air hung thick over downtown Portland, pressing against the tall windows of the Victoria Design Group office like an unspoken judgment. Inside, Emma Victoria stood motionless behind her father's desk, staring at the spreadsheet spread before her. Red ink bled across every column, the color of failure of everything slipping through her fingers. The numbers didn't just represent losses. They represented people, families, careers, legacies. The firm her grandfather had built 40 years ago was gasping for air, and no matter how hard she tried, Emma couldn't resuscitate it. Her father, Robert, sat across from her, his posture stooped, the proud edges of his personality worn down by exhaustion. The light from the window caught the silver in his hair, a reminder of how much time he had spent fighting a battle he was destined to lose. "It's over, Emma," he said quietly. His voice cracked under the weight of defeat. "The banks won't lend. Investors won't touch us. 1 more month, maybe less, and we'll lose everything." Emma pressed her hands against the desk to steady herself. She wanted to scream at the injustice of it, that their company was collapsing not because of incompetence, but because of guilt by association. A corruption scandal had swept through Portland's construction sector, taking down giants and parasites alike. The Victoria firm was clean, but that didn't matter. Perception was poison enough. "There has to be something," she whispered. "Somebody who'll take a chance on us." Her father looked up then, meeting her eyes with a mixture of sorrow and shame. "There is someone." The name dropped into the silence like a stone. Dominic Ashford. Emma had heard it whispered in boardrooms and trade conferences. The real estate magnate who turned abandoned warehouses into billion-dollar developments. The man who could buy entire city blocks before breakfast and demolish them before lunch. A genius, they called him. A shark, others said. Both descriptions felt true. "He came to me this morning," Robert continued. "He knows about our situation. He's offering to pay off the debts, refinance the firm, keep our people employed." But his throat tightened. "There's a condition." Emma's pulse quickened. "What condition?" "He wants to marry you." For a moment, she thought she hadn't heard correctly. The words didn't make sense, and they hung in the air, foreign and absurd. "Marry me?" she repeated. "For what? Publicity? Tax benefits?" Robert shook his head, weary. "He says he wants a partner who understands his business, someone who shares his vision for sustainable architecture. He's offering what he calls a mutual partnership, personal and professional." The room spun slightly as Emma sank into the leather chair. Her mind raced in the confusion, disbelief, anger. "That's not a partnership. That's a transaction." "I told him it was outrageous," Robert said, his voice breaking. "But Emma, he's serious. He's already drawn up a proposal." That evening, Emma met him. Dominic Ashford was not what she expected. His presence filled the restaurant before he spoke a word. Tall, sharp-featured, dark hair falling just out of place enough to look deliberate. He was the kind of man whose confidence didn't need announcement. When he stood to greet her, his gray-blue eyes assessed her with the precision of a man used to evaluating assets. But there was something else there, something almost unreadable. "Miss Victoria," he said, extending his hand. "You're exactly as I imagined, and composed, intelligent, and far too proud to ask for help. Then why am I here?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "Because you're also pragmatic." He gestured for her to sit. "You know talent when you see it, and I see yours, wasted under the rubble of your father's debts. Flattery isn't part of your business model, I assume." He smiled faintly. "No, efficiency is." He leaned forward. "Here's my offer. I'll pay off the debt, absorb the firm, retain every employee. In return, you'll marry me." Emma stared at him, half expecting him to smirk, to admit it was a joke. But he didn't. His expression remained perfectly calm, as though he were proposing a new construction project rather than a lifelong bond. "Why?" she asked finally. "Because I don't have time for courtship. I need a partner who understands architecture and sustainability. Someone who can stand beside me in meetings without crumbling under pressure. I'm offering security, and for you, your family, your legacy." She studied him. There was power in his stillness, in the quiet certainty of his tone. But there was also something unsettling beneath it, a shadow, an intensity that made her feel both seen and trapped. When she didn't answer immediately, He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "You think I'm offering you a deal, Miss Victoria? But this isn't business." His voice dropped, deep and deliberate. "When I make a commitment, I finish what I start. In boardrooms or in bed." The words landed like heat against her skin, shocking and magnetic. She wanted to recoil. But part of her, the part that thrived on challenges, that admired strength, couldn't look away. He slid a sleek black folder across the table. Inside, a simple contract, a signature line, a promise wrapped in peril. By the time Emma's pen touched paper, she wasn't sure if she was saving her family's company or selling her freedom to a man she barely knew. Outside, the city lights reflected off the restaurant glass, casting their faces in fractured gold. Somewhere in the hum of Portland's night, Emma Victoria crossed the invisible line between survival and surrender, and stepped into the orbit of a man whose darkness would either destroy her or teach her how to burn brighter than she ever had before. The morning of the wedding dawned pale and wind-washed, the kind of Oregon light that blurred the city skyline into silver. Emma woke early, long before the stylists arrived, and stood by her bedroom window watching the gulls wheel over the river. Somewhere beneath the calm surface of her thoughts, panic stirred. Today she would marry a man she'd known for 11 days. Her dress hung against the wardrobe like an unspoken vow, simple ivory silk, sleeveless, nothing ornamental. She had chosen it deliberately, wanting to feel like herself rather than the prop in a fairy tale. When her mother came in carrying the pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, Emma's eyes filled. "They brought her luck," Claire said softly. "Maybe they'll bring you courage." By afternoon, the chapel at Powell's Garden glowed with late sunlight. The ceremony was small. Parents, a handful of colleagues, the minister whose voice carried a steadiness Emma envied. Dominic stood at the altar in a navy suit, his expression unreadable until she reached him. Then something changed. His eyes softened, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw uncertainty there. The vows were brief but sincere. His voice when he spoke her name was low, deliberate, as if he were memorizing every syllable. "I promise to respect you," he said, "to build something honest and lasting with you." Emma's reply trembled only once. "I promise to share your journey wherever it leads." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Dominic bent to kiss her. It was meant to be formal, a seal upon a contract, yet the world seemed to still around them. The applause faded into a hush of heartbeat and breath. His hand at her waist, his warmth, the quiet strength of the moment. It wasn't transaction at all. It was connection. The reception was held at a small restaurant overlooking the Willamette River. Strings of lights swayed above the terrace as dusk fell. Dominic had chosen her favorite foods, how he had learned them she didn't know. They danced once slowly to a jazz version of The Way You Look Tonight. She was acutely aware of his hand against her back, of the careful space he left between them, of the promise in the way he looked at her when the song ended. Later, as the city lights flickered on, they drove west toward the coast. The road wound through dark forests and salt-sharp air until the sky opened to the Pacific. His house stood on the cliff, glass and timber shaped by wind and tide. Inside, the scent of cedar mingled with the ocean. Dominic showed her the terrace first, the horizon stretching endless, the surf breaking far below. "When I was a boy," he said, "I used to think the ocean was the only thing big enough to forgive mistakes." They ate by candlelight, the sea beyond them black and alive. Conversation slipped easily between them. Architecture, childhood, what drove them to build things that lasted. She saw in him not only the tycoon who made cities rise, but the man who had once built dreams with his own hands. When they finally stood together at the glass doors, moonlight spilling across the floor, he took her hand. "You don't have to be afraid," he murmured. "We'll learn each other's pace." And in that moment, surrounded by the whisper of waves and the scent of rain, Emma realized she wasn't afraid at all. The marriage that had begun as an act of desperation had become something fragile and luminous. Two strangers poised on the edge of trust, about to discover whether love could be built as carefully and beautifully as any structure they had ever designed. The honeymoon air still clung to Emma's skin when the city skyline came back into view. Portland's glass towers gleamed under a thin winter sun, cold and beautiful like Dominic himself. The drive from the coast had been quiet. They spoke of small things, The house, the tide, the way the gulls cried before dawn. But beneath the calm, Emma sensed a shift. He was already sliding back into the other world, the one made of contracts and deadlines and men who measured worth and profits. The elevator to his penthouse was a private one, silent except for the hum of steel cables. When the doors opened, Emma stepped into a space so immaculate it almost unnerved her. Every surface reflected light. Every line was deliberate. It felt less like a home than a fortress built to keep emotion out. "This is where I spend most of my time," Dominic said. His voice was casual, but his eyes followed her as if gauging whether she approved. "It's beautiful," she answered honestly, tracing a finger along the cold edge of a marble counter. "But it doesn't look lived in," he smiled faintly. "Then maybe you can change that." It was meant as an invitation, but the words carried weight. She turned away, unsure if she was being offered a place in his life, or a role in a play he'd already written. That evening, he left for a board meeting. "Only a few hours," he promised. "Everything's in the middle of a new acquisition." When the elevator doors closed behind him, the apartment felt enormous. Emma poured herself tea and wandered through the rooms. A study lined with blueprints and framed awards. A library with more financial journals than novels. A locked door at the end of the hallway. She tried the handle. It didn't move, her stomach tightened. She told herself it was probably a storage room. Every man had a place for clutter, but curiosity whispered otherwise. A man like Dominic didn't lock rooms without reason. The next morning she found him already dressed, phone pressed to his ear, expression carved in steel. "No," he said quietly. "We keep Project Seraph on hold until I say otherwise." When he noticed her watching, his tone softened. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford." "Project Seraph?" she asked lightly. "Something new?" He hesitated for half a second, barely enough for anyone else to notice. "Just a code name for an old development. Nothing important." Then he kissed her forehead and changed the subject, but the name lodged in her mind. Seraph, an angel, a guardian, or a warning. Days turned into weeks. Emma began to visit the offices of Ashford Holdings, learning the rhythm of the empire she had married into. The employees were polite but guarded. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Still, she listened. And one afternoon, while reviewing design proposals, she overheard two project managers whispering in the corridor. "Seraph file got pulled again. Dominic doesn't want her to see it. She's his wife, not his partner." The words hit like a chill. When she stepped into the hall, the men froze. "Something wrong?" she asked. They exchanged looks. "Nothing, Mrs. Ashford, just logistics." That night she couldn't sleep. Dominic was in his study, the glow of his laptop painting his face in blue light. He looked up when she entered. "You should rest. I will soon." She lingered by the doorway. "Dominic, why does everyone act like I'm not supposed to ask about Project Seraph?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask slipped. "Because it's complicated." Complicated or dangerous? Both. He stood, walking to the window. The city shimmered below them. "You wanted a partner, Emma. I need you to trust me, for now." "I do trust you," she said softly. "But trust doesn't mean silence." He turned then, and the look in his eyes was both admiration and warning. "You're brave. That's what I liked about you." When he touched her cheek, the world seemed to still, and for a heartbeat she forgot every suspicion. Yet as she fell asleep later, she could still hear his earlier words echoing, "On hold until I say otherwise." 2 days later, a courier delivered an envelope addressed to her. Inside was a single photograph. Dominic at a construction site 5 years earlier, standing beside a man whose name she recognized from the scandal that had destroyed her father's firm. Beneath the photo, typed neatly, "Project Seraph. Ask him what he buried." The note trembled in her hands. Somewhere beyond the walls of their perfect apartment, the ocean thundered in her memory. Dominic had saved her family, rescued her dreams, and promised her a life built on honesty. But the photograph whispered a different story, one that could bring everything crashing down. As the city lights flickered against the glass, Emma realized that the man she was beginning to love might also be the man who had once destroyed everything she'd tried to protect. And for the first time since their wedding night, she was truly afraid. Rain had settled over Portland, a gray curtain that turned the glass skyline into smudged reflections. From the window of Dominic's penthouse, Emma watched drops race each other down the pane, while the photograph trembled in her hand. Ask him what he buried. She could hear Dominic in the kitchen, his voice low on a phone call. She tried to listen, but the words blurred into static. Every instinct told her the note was bait, yet the ache in her chest told her the truth was already hiding somewhere close. When he ended the call, he crossed the room with the easy confidence that always made people move out of his way. "You're quiet," he said. "Thinking," she replied. "About?" She folded the photograph before he could see it. "About how little I really know you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe that's what keeps things interesting. That night, after he fell asleep, she slipped from bed, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. The locked door at the end of the hallway waited like a question she was finally ready to answer. She had noticed earlier that Dominic kept a small security tablet on his desk. It controlled the lighting, temperature, and locks. One tap on the screen, a quiet click, and the door gave way. Inside was not a storage room. It was an archive. Blueprints, hard drives, sealed boxes, each labeled Project Seraph. At the center stood a model of a high-rise complex, sleek and modern, surrounded by tiny trees and a miniature park. At first glance, it looked like another of his sustainable developments, until she saw the red-stamped folder beside it marked Accident File. Her hands shook as she opened it. Photos of twisted steel beams, a collapsed construction site, and a list of casualties. At the bottom, Serafina Ashford, structural engineer, deceased. The world tilted. Serafina. The project's name wasn't an angel after all. It was a person, someone he had loved. Before she could process the thought, the lights flickered. Then a sound, soft, deliberate, echoed in the hallway. She turned, heart hammering. A shadow shifted outside the door. "Mrs. Ashford," a man's voice said smoothly. "I'm going to need that file." He stepped into the light. One of Dominic's senior executives, Grant Lowell, the same man from the photograph beside Dominic years ago. His smile was wrong, polished over something sharp. "What is this?" Emma demanded. "Insurance," he said. "Your husband is trying to erase a mistake. But people died, Mrs. Ashford, and I can't let you ruin the cleanup." He reached for the folder. Emma backed away. "Dominic doesn't know I'm here," she said quickly, "but he will. That's the point." Grant's voice softened. "He'll do anything to protect you, even hand over what I want." Before she could move, he snatched the folder from her hands and was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the lock re-engaging. When Dominic found her minutes later, she was trembling. "Emma, what happened?" She told him everything, the break-in, the man, the stolen file. As she spoke, color drained from his face. "Grant," he said under his breath. "I should have fired him years ago." "Dominic," she whispered. "Who was Serafina?" He closed his eyes, the truth finally too heavy to hide. "My sister," he said. "She designed that tower. When it collapsed, she was inside. Grant covered the violations to keep investors calm. I found out too late. And my father's firm was collateral." He finished bitterly. "Grant funneled the blame toward your company to bury the evidence." The pieces slammed together in her mind. Her family's ruin, his guilt, the marriage proposal, it had all been tangled in the same web. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought I could fix it before you ever had to know." A sharp knock interrupted them. Dominic's phone buzzed, a message with a single line. "If you want her safe, bring the drives. Tonight." He looked up, his expression no longer the cool mask of a businessman, but the raw fear of a man with something to lose. "He's not bluffing," he said. "Grant's desperate. He'll use you to force my hand." Emma's mind raced. "Then we don't give him the drives, we expose him." Dominic met her eyes. "That's exactly what he's afraid of." Rain hammered against the windows as sirens wailed somewhere below. The city that had once felt like home now pulsed with danger. Dominic took her hand, his grip firm, steady. "Whatever happens," he said, "we face it together." For the first time, Emma saw what lay beneath his control. Not arrogance, but the terror of losing someone else he loved. She nodded. "Then let's finish what you started." They left the penthouse before dawn, a single flash drive hidden inside the lining of Emma's coat, carrying proof that could destroy Grant, and perhaps Dominic's empire along with him. As they stepped into the wet Portland streets, thunder rolled in the distance, echoing like a warning. Somewhere ahead, the truth waited. And for the first time since the marriage began, Emma wasn't just fighting for legacy or survival. She was fighting for love that had finally become real, and for both of them to make it out alive. Night still clung to Portland when they left the city limits, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. Dominic drove without speaking, jaw set, eyes fixed on the winding coastal road. Emma sat beside him, clutching the flash drive hidden inside her coat. Every few miles she glanced behind them, half expecting the dark shape of a car in pursuit. "He won't go far," Dominic said finally. "Grant's too proud to disappear quietly. He'll try to control the story before we can." "How?" "By erasing everything that links him to Serafina's collapse." His hands tightened on the wheel. "The original construction records are stored at one of our remote archives, an old site outside Astoria. If he gets there first, he can destroy the last proof. Then we get there before he does." A thin smile touched his mouth. "You've become dangerous, Mrs. Ashford." "Maybe I finally learned from the best." The banter eased the fear for only a heartbeat. The rain thickened, drumming against the windshield like a warning. By dawn they reached the coast. The ocean was a gray monster thrashing against the rocks, the wind sharp with salt and electricity. Dominic turned off the highway onto a gravel track that led through pines bent low under the storm. At the end stood a weather-stained warehouse, the old archive half hidden by fog. Inside, the air smelled of rust and damp paper. Rows of metal cabinets stretched into darkness. Dominic found the generator switch. Fluorescent lights flickered to life, humming faintly. "Look for anything labeled Seraph," he said. Emma moved down an aisle, pulling open drawers filled with blueprints and permits. Her pulse echoed in her ears. Somewhere behind her, Dominic cursed softly. Then she heard footsteps that didn't belong to either of them. "Dominic," she whispered. He froze, listening. Another step. Then a voice drifted from the shadows. "I told you to bring the drives, not the girl." Grant emerged from between the cabinets, trenchcoat soaked, pistol hanging loose at his side. His smile was calm, almost pitying. "You should have stayed quiet, Emma. Some things don't need resurrecting." Dominic moved in front of her. "You won't touch her." Grant raised the gun slightly. "You can't protect everyone, Ashford." "You never could." The taunt hit its mark. Dominic's shoulders stiffened. For a moment, Emma saw the grief that had lived beneath his control since the night she met him. The ghost of his sister. The guilt that had driven every ruthless decision. Grant stepped closer. "Hand over the drive and we walk away. I'll tell the board it was a clerical error. You'll keep your empire, she'll keep her pretty conscience." Emma's mind raced. If they gave him the drive, everything Serafina had died for, the truth would vanish again. She caught Dominic's arm. "Trust me." Before he could stop her, she turned to Grant. "You're right," she said softly. "Some things don't need resurrecting. They need witnesses." She pulled a small recorder from her pocket, something she had hidden there since they left Portland. "You've been confessing for 2 minutes," she said. "Every word is backed up to the cloud." Grant's composure fractured. The gun lifted higher. "You think you're clever?" A crash split the silence, metal collapsing. Dominic lunged, knocking the weapon aside. The shot cracked, ricocheted off steel. Papers exploded into the air like frightened birds. The two men hit the ground, struggling, the gun skittering across the floor. Emma snatched the weapon and aimed it with shaking hands. "Stop!" Both froze. Rain leaked through the broken skylight, streaking down Dominic's face. Grant looked at her with something like disbelief. "You won't shoot?" "No," she said, voice steady. "But I will make sure you face what you did." Dominic rose slowly. "It's over, Grant." Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. The GPS beacon Emma had activated earlier had done its job. Grant's shoulders slumped. For the first time he looked small, human. "You don't understand, Ashford. If this comes out, the board will destroy you too." "Maybe," Dominic said, "but at least I'll be able to look my sister in the eye again." When the police lights flashed through the doorway minutes later, Emma's knees gave out. Dominic caught her, pulling her against him. His heart pounded against her cheek. "It's finished," he whispered. "No," she murmured. "It's just beginning." Outside, dawn broke through the storm, pale light spilling over the sea. The wind carried the scent of salt and renewal. As officers led Grant away, Emma looked up at Dominic. For the first time since they met, there was no distance between them. No secrets, no contracts. Just the quiet understanding that they had built something real out of wreckage. He brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. "You saved more than the company." Maybe we saved each other, she said, and together they stepped into the rising light, not knowing what battles still waited beyond the horizon, but certain now of one thing, that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The trial began 6 months later, in the marble courthouse overlooking downtown Portland. Outside, cameras lined the steps. Microphones flashed like lightning each time Emma and Dominic appeared. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. The headlines had named it the Ashford Scandal, but to Emma it was something far more personal. A reckoning for every silent night, every broken promise, every person who had lost their future beneath concrete and greed. Grant Lowell sat at the defense table, his expression carefully blank. Across from him, Dominic straightened his tie with a hand that didn't quite hide the tremor. He had refused the company's legal team, insisting on testifying himself. "If I built this empire," he had told Emma, "then I can face what it became." When Dominic took the stand, the courtroom fell still. His voice was steady as he described the accident that had killed his sister, the bribes that had followed, and his own failure to see the truth sooner. At one point, he looked directly at Grant. "I told myself I was saving jobs. In truth, I was saving my pride." Emma watched from the front row, fingers clenched together. She could feel the room shift, sympathy, disbelief, anger all colliding. The jury's eyes softened. But she knew what was coming. The prosecutor's final question cut through the silence like a blade. "Mr. Ashford, did you benefit financially from the concealment of the Serafina Tower collapse?" "Yes," he said quietly. "I did," the words echoed in the vaulted chamber. In that instant, Emma felt both pride and pain. Honesty was the foundation she had begged for, but the truth came with chains. When the verdict arrived days later, Grant was sentenced to years in prison for fraud and manslaughter. Dominic was cleared of criminal intent, but fined heavily and barred from holding executive office for 5 years. Ashford Holdings fell into receivership. The skyscrapers he had built would stand, but his name was gone from their facades. They retreated to the coast after the reporters left. The old house at Cannon Beach waited, windswept and quiet. The sea was the same restless gray it had been on their wedding night. "You lost everything," Emma said one evening, watching him mend a broken hinge on the porch window. He smiled without looking up. "Not everything. The buildings were never the legacy that mattered." She sank beside him, head resting against his shoulder. "Do you regret telling the truth?" He considered the question for a long moment. Truth doesn't give back what it takes, but lies keep taking forever. They sat in silence, listening to the waves. Outside, the horizon was bleeding from silver into blue. For the first time in months, the storm inside her eased. In the months that followed, they built something new, a small architecture collective that designed sustainable housing for families displaced by corporate developments. They named it Seraph Foundation. Each project bore Serafina's initials hidden in the design. Investors avoided them. Profits were modest, yet every structure stood clean and strong, rooted in purpose rather than pride. One evening, as the foundation celebrated its first completed project, a journalist approached Emma. "You could have disappeared," he said. "Instead, you kept building." "Why?" She smiled faintly. "Because truth deserves a roof over its head." Later that night, back at the coast, Emma found Dominic on the terrace, staring at the ocean. The wind caught his hair. The moon carved silver into his eyes. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The empire?" He shook his head. "No, I miss the certainty. Power makes you believe the ground won't ever give way, but it always does." He turned toward her. "You taught me how to build something that doesn't collapse, no matter the storm." She stepped closer, sliding her hand into his. "Then let's keep building." He hesitated, voice rough. "I can't promise we won't fall again." She smiled through the salt air. "Falling's fine, Dominic, as long as we fall together." Weeks later, a letter arrived, an offer from an international firm to partner with the Seraph Foundation. It meant expansion, influence, maybe a return to prominence. But the contract included one condition. Dominic could never publicly attach his name. His record was still stained. Emma read the document twice, then placed it on the table between them. "This could change everything," she said. He met her gaze. "You decide." She thought of her father's old office, of the city that had once turned its back on them, of the promise they had made to build honestly. Finally, she nodded. We'll sign, but only if the first project goes up in the name of the victims, not the builders. Dominic smiled. Then that's the deal. They signed at dawn. As the ink dried, light poured through the windows, painting the paper gold. Outside, the tide crept higher, washing over the footprints they'd left on the sand. Months later, when the first building opened, a glass and stone community center named Serafina House, Emma stood before the crowd, wind tugging at her hair. "We built this," she said, "from the ruins of our mistakes. May it stand longer than any of our fears." Applause rippled across the plaza. In the back, Dominic watched silently, hands in his pockets, pride and peace mingling in his expression. When she joined him afterward, he whispered, "You finished it." She shook her head, eyes bright. "No, we finally began it." They turned toward the ocean once more, the city rising behind them. Smaller now, but honest. The wind carried the distant sound of gulls, and the sea breathed in and out, endless and forgiving. The truth had taken everything they thought they wanted, but in its place it had given them something unbreakable.